I don't know why it is, but when you sip a Negroni, I always feel as though I'm rich.
Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitter's acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaken, cocktail fans? This is the Modern Bar Cart podcast, and I am your curious host, Eric Kozlik. I want to thank you for joining me once again this week and allowing me to guide you through the strange, beautiful, and often bizarre landscape of cocktails and home bartending. You know how we roll. Sometimes we're hanging out in a distillery with someone who makes spirits for a living. Sometimes we're grilling a professional bartender about the ins and outs of the trade. Sometimes I'm giving you all the nerdy science and technical nuances of things like ice or citrus or homemade syrups. And sometimes, like in this episode, we're hanging out with an author, someone who's taken the time to painstakingly research all the details of some corner of the cocktail kingdom so that they can be arrayed on the page before your very eyes in a new and thought-provoking manner. This week's guest is Mark Forsyth, aka the Inky Fool, who is a prolific author, rhetorician, and etymologist. What do those last two words mean? Well, basically, Mark is concerned with words, the way we use them, and how that has evolved over the years, passing from mouth to mouth and transforming from an ancestral grunt to an entry in the Oxford English Dictionary. Mark's latest project is a book called A Short History of Drunkenness. And there's a lot to talk about when the vast sweep of human history is your topic of choice. But before we dive into this bizarre and thoroughly enlightening conversation, I want to give you the chance to make yourself a drink. This week's featured cocktail is two things. Number one, it's a PSA of sorts, and number two, it's not a cocktail at all. Guys, I live in Washington, D.C., aka the swamp. You know, the one that was supposed to be drained by now? Well, it's not, and it's hot. We've had like 5 straight days of 90+ degree weather, and I'm dying here. Add to that the fact that this week marks the 4th of July holiday for us here in the US, so I thought I'd throw out a fun fact that might help you enjoy your hot weather drinking and stay safe when it's super hot outside. If you're wondering what type of beer to get when you're planning to grill out in the sun or attend some other event in the heat of the day, consider looking for something called a session ale. Now, I wasn't aware of what this really meant when I first got into beer. I thought it was kind of a riff on the word saison, which is like a citrusy wheat beer, but that's not the case. A session beer is something with a fairly low ABV, usually no more than 5%, and it can be as low as, somewhere in the 3s. This allows the drinker to pace her or himself and enjoy a number of them safely without getting totally wasted. If you follow craft beer, you know how trends go. Everybody usually opts for the booziest, hoppiest, bitterest, or most obscure flavors. But session beers defy that logic. Historically, they're moving in the direction of the weak beers that used to be completely pervasive straight through the 18th century when people couldn't really trust the quality of the water and needed that little bit of alcohol to ensure that the water was safe to drink. We'll talk more about that in today's episode. One bonus of a session beer is that you get less inebriated and less dehydrated, which are both bonuses when you're operating in extremely hot conditions or attempting to remember everyone's hot dog and hamburger orders if you're the person running the grill. If you're here in the US, there's a ton of great session beers available around the country. Most large microbreweries offer at least some seasonal take on this style. One pervasive option happens to be Founders All Day IPA, and I can personally vouch for both the flavor and the sessionability of that particular option. But the moral of the story here is go low ABV and please be safe this Independence Day as you brave the heat. With that, let's return to the topic at hand, drunkenness through the ages. Some of the things I discuss in this conversation with author Mark Forsyth include, and I'm not kidding, you can't make this stuff up, why Hitler is partially responsible for spam email, one important reason why you shouldn't challenge a Malaysian tree shrew to a drinking competition, why the Drunken Monkey hypothesis explains a lot about how and why people drink the way they do, the difference between wet and dry cultures, one old-fashioned workaround for observant Muslims to sneak in a quick drink by screaming loudly and suddenly, how to feed your dead ancestors with drunken vomit, and much, much more. After that list of highlights, all I can really say is buckle up, folks. This interview is fun, weird, and fascinating, and it puts you in touch with some essential parts of the human condition that we haven't managed to escape from, even thousands and thousands of years after the first proto-human got drunk on rotten fruit and told his buddies. Please enjoy this thrilling conversation with author and etymologist Mark Forsyth.
Mark, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be
So
here.
today we are chatting with Mark Forsyth, who is an author and etymologist, I suppose.
Yes, I suppose so. At least I've written a book on etymology. I did. My first 3 books were all about the English language and etymology, which has studied where words come from and the strange and weird stories behind everyday words.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those in the cocktail tradition as well. But today we're going to be talking about one of your more recent projects, which is a book called A Short History of Drunkenness.
That's right, yes. How, why, when, and where mankind has gotten merry from the Stone Age to the present. It's a subject very, very dear to my heart. Words and booze and combinations of the two.
Right. So can you just start by just quickly introducing us to Mark Forsyth, telling us who you are and how you came to approach the project that you're currently doing today?
So, I'm a writer. I write about all sorts of things. I first had some success with writing books about words and the history of the English language. And it's a subject that fascinates me because English is something, I mean, as long as you're a native speaker, that we all grew up with and we take for granted and we don't stop and think about. We don't think about so simple things as to where words come from and what the connection between 2 words might be. So to find the strange stories behind the very familiar, I find fascinating, and I found etymology just this mine filled with very, very funny stories, really, and little moments that make you go, oh, of course, now I see, now I understand. That's why those 2 words go together, and that's what it all means. So you take, I mean, really simple example. If you're a fan of something, you're a fan of Madonna or Michael Jackson, or where does the word fan come from? There, does it mean like the thing you wave when it's hot to keep to cool you down? And of course, it's not. It's just short for the word fanatic. So fanatic is. It's such a. These things are often so simple the second you see them, but you don't see them because you don't stop and you don't look, and they're also often loads of times the stories are really, really funny or strange and weird. The connection between why you get spam email and the connection between that and the tinned meat still available in many shops and still a trademark is a very odd and strange story, which I won't go into at the moment, but which involves Adolf Hitler and Monty Python and the early days of the internet and all sorts of very strange stuff like that. And also, obviously, it kind of blends into alcohol at times. Things like, what is champagne and how does the word relate to campaign or to camping it up or to Mein Kampf or to being a champion. And in fact, they're all cognates. They all come from the same root by various long, complicated roots. And so my first 3 books were all about the English language, its history, rhetoric, the figures of rhetoric, and which again is something you look at, but you don't. We all sort of know, but we don't notice. Once you say "Home, sweet home, oh captain, my captain, burn, baby, burn, Bond, James Bond, to be or not to be," you can see that there's a pattern forming there, but probably a pattern you have never noticed. The Greeks called that one diacope. It's looking at familiar things and seeing how strange they are, and then making them funny and entertaining for a mass audience.
Yeah, that's really funny. I'm going to look up the spam story. I'm sure it's out there, and we'll link to it in the show notes if I can dig it up. But
I can give it to you quickly if you like.
Well, I think you teased it so effectively that I think we'll have to hit it before we move on.
Okay, the spam story. Spam story is simple. You had spam, which was first produced by Hormel Food Incorporated, as I recall, in America in the 1930s. It was a trademark. It's short for spiced ham. And during the Second World War, Hitler tried to cut off Britain from all food supplies. And so those North Atlantic convoys, you probably heard about the Second World War, which were being besieged by U-boats and fired on, and lots of people died trying to get important stuff to Britain. A lot of that important stuff was just tinned meat. An awful lot of it was just spam being sent across the Atlantic. And so spam became a massive part of the British diet during the Second World War, and specifically the British working class diet. And as a result, in the 1960s, Monty Python did a sketch in which somebody goes into a really rather rubbishy cafe and asks what's on the menu, and the woman behind you may well have seen the sketch. The woman says, "Oh, we've got roast spam, fried spam, spam with spam, spoiled spam, spam on the side with spam." And then in the background, because it's a Monty Python sketch, a bunch of Vikings sitting at a table start singing spam, 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 spam. Went on and on forever. And therefore, in Monty Python, for some reason, very popular with computer programmers. Don't know why. Indeed, there's a computer programming language called Python, which is named after them. Early days of the internet, there was this practical joke. People would send each other emails with a program saying, run this program. If you ran the program had two commands. Command number one was print the word spam on the screen. Command number two was go back to the first command. The result was, if you ever ran the program, you just got the word spam, 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 spam going on and on forever down your screen. That was a spam email, and spam emails therefore became a generic term for any email you got that you didn't really want, and that's why you get spam emails today, and it's still a registered trademark of Hormel Food.
Wow, that is quite the story. And I think that's a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about, how kind of the projects that you immerse yourself in almost result in you walking around in a day-to-day world where we are also walking around, but you're seeing these little connections that most of us are oblivious to, and it must be a really rich and interesting set of topics and projects that you immerse yourself in. So really excited to dig into your work on drunkenness. I figured that we could start at the beginning if you want to. Is that can we do that?
We can, yeah. We can go right to the very, very beginning, to the primordial soup, if you like, which was alcoholic.
Yes. So I had a question for you, and I, because I've spent some time working with cocktails and with drinking, there's something that I've come across in the past, and I'm not quite sure if it's actual science or if it's pseudoscience, but it's something called the Drunken Monkey hypothesis, or at least that's how I've seen it phrased. So I was wondering,
yeah, I know it well,
if you might expound on whether or not this is a valid hypothesis, and kind of explain it to our listeners.
It's pretty convincing. I should point out before we get going that all of the higher apes and most intelligent mammals, and even some very stupid mammals, like a drink. They will drink alcohol whenever they can get hold of it. It's just they can't make it. But alcohol does occur naturally. If you just leave fruit to rot, it starts producing alcohol. And alcohol is a very good source of energy. And human beings are uniquely good at processing it. We are the second best animal in the entire world for taking our booze, after the Malaysian tree shrew. So never ever get into a drinking contest with the Malaysian tree shrew. But after that, we have a quite specific mutation in our genes, which goes back about 10 million years, which allows us to process alcohol way better than most animals and to get more energy out of it. About 10% of all the enzymes in your liver are there just to get energy out of alcohol. And this led people to say, why do we have that? Interestingly, 10 million years ago is just about the time we came down from the trees. And so the theory runs something along the lines of we came down from the trees to get this ripe, rotting fruit which has fallen onto the forest floor. That's why we come down from the trees, which has this alcohol in it, which it's great for our energy. We actually develop a nose. We're like great white sharks can smell blood, miles and miles away. We're like that with alcohol. Humans have this incredible ability to smell alcohol, which other animals don't have. So we wandered around looking for our rotting fruit. When we found it, we ate a bit, but it was a big find to find the proper alcoholic rotting fruit. And so we then needed another little mutation in our genes, which we have, which dates from the same time, which is to make us eat a lot. And I don't know if you've had that thing of going on a night out, having quite a bit to drink, and then desperately needing a burger, or in Britain it's usually a kebab or a pizza or some food. That's because drinking alcohol actually triggers. It's the famine response in your brain. It makes you hungry. It's the same as if you're actually being starved. When you say I'm starving when you're drunk, you actually sort of are. And so you therefore eat loads and loads. This, you can now store it as fat. You can survive for days on this. This is great. But, and this is the final part of the Drunken Monkey hypothesis, you get drunk. And this is a little bit dangerous. If you're just lying around on the forest floor on your own, drunk, and along comes a saber-toothed tiger or Tyrannosaurus Rex, which would be achronological, but there we are, then you need to be able to protect yourself from that predator. And that, the final part of the Drunken Monkey hypothesis, is that that's why humans drink socially. We drink together, and we've always, according to the Drunken Monkey hypothesis, drunk together so that we can fight off predators, so that we can protect each other when we are helplessly drunk, which I rather like.
Wow. It's so interesting that using the theory of evolution, right, which is largely influenced by outside pressures, right, the kind of concept of natural selection, these outside forces that are coming in and dictating who survives and who does not survive to pass on their genes. It's fascinating that something like this can have such a widespread impact on something that appears to be so far downstream from your genes, like the fact that you like to drink with other people.
Yeah, it's amazing, but it is a classic form of natural selection, that the people who got drunk on their own would end up being the prey of whatever nasty predator was around, because if you're passed out unconscious on the forest floor drunk on your own, you're in trouble. So aggressively selected for, according to the Drunken Monkey hypothesis, which I find very convincing. And I should point out that despite its comical name, it's a theory that's taken very seriously amongst evolutionary scientists.
Right. One other factoid that I will throw into the conversation, and I'm not quite sure how well supported this happens to be, but when it comes to our predispositions to like certain tastes, for example, obviously, you said that it was quite a find to find this, rotting fruit on the ground because it was high in sugar and then also alcohol. So we get the energy from both the sugar and the alcohol still there. And then, of course, the buzz from the alcohol. But when things tend to rot, there's very many times an acid or kind of a sour taste to them. And of the tastes between sweet, salty, and sour are the ones that we tend to prefer most. And then, bitterness is something that we are actually predisposed to kind of avoid because of its association with certain things that are poisonous or bad for the human body.
And also in terms of the acid taste, alcohol which has gone over. Remember, if you just leave wine long enough, it turns into vinegar, which I kind of like vinegar, but not the halfway house between wine and vinegar. So yeah, that's warning you off in that sense, or it would appear to be doing so. Yeah.
Right. So it's just interesting that you look at so many of the cocktails that are popular today, and they do have in many cases that fresh fruit juice, or the use of, in some of the more high-end concept bars, they're actually using citric acid, which is dried lemon juice. And it blows my mind that if you go back far enough and you think about your distant ancestors, that this could possibly be related to who got killed by a tiger and who drank with their friends.
Yeah, it's an amazing thought that it can go back that far. And in some sense it goes back even further. There's a lovely detail I found out while researching the book is fruit flies, because they eat fruit. They take in a lot of alcohol. When a male fruit fly is rejected by a female fruit fly in their very basic sexual advances, the male fruit fly dramatically ups his alcohol consumption immediately afterwards. Now, nobody knows why that is, because we don't know whether fruit flies think or have emotions or are conscious or anything like that. But it just did make me sort of yearn to believe that the fruit fly is drinking to forget.
Yeah, he's a little bit lonely when his lady leaves.
Even though that one probably isn't true to some extent.
Sure. Well, what about when, after we came down from the trees, we started forming more organized societies, and things like language developed and social hierarchies. Is there anything about the way that we consumed alcohol as humans that started to change or evolve or become more clear when societies formed?
Well, I mean, another argument, which is very convincing, is that society actually, or farming started, hunter-gatherer and Stockton farming started to obtain alcohol. We settled down to farm so that we could make our own beer. And this is another one which sounds crazy until you stop and think about it, which is that if you are hunting and gathering, eating other animals, then you get a lot of vitamin B out of other animals, which you need to not die. Whereas if you just stop and you start farming and making bread has no vitamin B in it. So if you tried to do that, just start with the bread, you would definitely die. Fortunately, though, beer, which is also made out of grain, wheat, barley, etc., beer contains vitamin B. So if we settled down to farms and agricultural economy, we must have started with beer, or at least beer and bread right next to each other. And beer makes sense to start with, because if you have a pile of barley and you want to get the most energy out of it, the best thing you can do is turn it into beer in terms of the calorie count rather than into bread. So yeah, civilization, farming started with beer. That's a very widely accepted thought, and then things. It's connected to everything we do because we've always been drinkers. When writing started just as usually as a form of IOUs, an accounting system that you noted down. You've given me 5 bushels of grain, draw a bushel of grain, and return IOU 7 women, draw 7 women. One of the earliest letters, therefore, in these pictogram alphabets was the symbol for beer, so that's right there from the beginning. And then these primitive societies form with their gods and goddesses, and always there's a goddess of beer and a goddess of drunkenness, and usually female in the early days, Ninkasi and Hathor in ancient Egypt, who was the crazy beer goddess who went between being the goddess of love, the goddess of destruction, but always the drunk goddess.
Got it. It's interesting that you bring up agriculture in that way, kind of agriculture for the sake of brewing. And I was reading recently a book that's pretty famous, at least here in the U.S. It's called 'Sapiens by a gentleman named Yuval Noah Harari. And
I've got that on my pile of books to read, actually. It's there, about number 10.
It's very good, and one of the points that he makes, I won't spoil, it's actually a rather hard book to spoil for someone because it covers so much, but one of the points that he makes is that when people decided to begin farming, when agriculture kind of evolved as a widespread practice, we kicked off something that we were completely incapable as humans of stopping, and one of his hypotheses is that we were actually, when we were running around as hunter-gatherers in the forest and coming across these caches of fermenting fruit, that was actually perhaps a time in history when we had the most free time, the best diets, and there's a lot of arguments that can be made against that or in favor of other types of lifestyles, but it's interesting that this agriculture, this pursuit of drunkenness may have kicked off so many more things in history than we otherwise would suspect.
Yeah, I mean, an awful lot of early world trade is getting booze from one place to another. Ancient Egypt made contact with the Levant, but the Eastern Mediterranean, but they didn't like each other very much. Ancient Egypt basically maintained trade to get the wine from the Eastern Mediterranean because Egypt was a beer-producing country. All the best wines out in the east, and so yeah, it's driven so much. I've got to say though, just as a little parenthetical thing, whenever I hear the theory that we would all be happier if we were running around in the woods eating fruit and getting killed by saber-toothed tigers, I don't believe it unless the author has actually given it all up to go and run around in the woods.
Right. Yeah, he was pretty good about hedging his bets. But yeah, it's just, I think the point that it reinforces is that, as we go forward in history and we see a lot of systems that are created to, I suppose, keep a very small number of people wealthy and happy and fat, and the large majority of the rest of the people, in poverty, then that wouldn't have been the case if we hadn't set down stakes and created an agricultural society. But we can't really go and change that now, so it's all speculation here. I wanted to talk about maybe some of the more religious drinking, because you were starting to speak about some of these gods and goddesses of alcohol and revelry, and that's an area where I don't really know a whole lot. I know about Bacchus, who is the Greek god or Greco-Roman god of drinking and drunkenness, but I don't really know much else about how these gods were worshipped and what people did to get drunk using this god as an excuse.
Well, it is amazing, because it's one of the reason I wanted to write this book in the first place and really look at things was alcohol is something that's so familiar. I've been doing it almost every day for the last 20 years, etc. But we just assume that these are the contexts in which you drink and these aren't, and these are the rules by which you drink and these aren't. But of course, they've changed, and loads of cultures have had religious drinking. You drink, you get drunk in order to celebrate God or to have a religious experience. In ancient China, you drank in order to communicate with the spirits of your ancestors. You drank, and real binge drinking, but you drank until you saw your ancestor in front of you. And I mean, I've got pretty drunk in my life, but if I ever saw my dear departed grandmother, I would stop. But there are loads of cultures like this. It goes all the way from the South Pacific across China. It's been in Europe and in South America. There's one tribe in Ecuador who believe the only way to feed the spirits of the ancestors is by getting so drunk that you vomit onto the ground, and it's only drunken holy vomit on the ground which can feed them. So an example of this, a good example, would be ancient Egypt, and it's a strange story. The goddess Hathor, who she was occasionally frightening goddess who had been in the process of killing all mankind when another god gave her beer, and she went, oh, this is great, stopped killing mankind and had a nice nap. So the Egyptian festival of drunkenness, for example, yearly festival, takes place at the temple of the goddess Hathor, and it's attended by the elite largely. This isn't for peasants, this is the elite nobleman royalty. It's to celebrate the return of Hathor from her exile in the south. So a boat comes up the Nile with, it appears a statue of Hathor on it. Everyone gathers round on the banks of the Nile. It's at sunset. Everyone's wearing their finest clothing, and they're wearing perfume and beautiful scented oils. So everything smells lovely. And the priests take the statue from the boat, and they're surrounded by dancers, and they lead it into the temple courtyard, and everyone dancing and follows. And then in the temple courtyard, they all set about drinking, and really binge drinking. And the ancient Egyptians drank like crazy. They were absolute just booze hounds, and they really went for it in a binge way. Men and women, I should point out, this is about 50% men, 50% women. Ancient Egyptian women drank just as much, if not more, than the men. And so you drank and drank and drank and drank until you vomited. And then you drank more, and you drank and drank and drank till you vomited again, and then repeat. And you have to keep going and keep going and keep going. And it must have been awful, really. But at the end, towards the end of this, in the small hours, you get to the point where it goes from the drinking to an orgy, and everyone just slept with their form, which must have been awful, given on all the vomit.
Right.
But they did. People indeed were conceived with perfect strangers at this festival in the temple. But it was a rather proud thing to be conceived. People put up monuments to themselves saying, I was conceived in the temple at the festival of drunkenness. And then at the end of the night, as it's getting on for dawn, you do what everybody does after a lot of drinking, vomiting, and having sex, which is you just fell asleep where you were. And the temple courtyard would be filled with snoring revelers. And whilst they were asleep, the priests, who had remained sober throughout, would go into the side chapel where the giant statue of Hathor was kept. And while everyone was asleep, they would wheel it out, or somehow transport it out into the centre of the courtyard. And then they'd wait till dawn, when the light of the dawn sun would hit the face of the giant statue. And at that moment, they would pull out lots of tambourines and cymbals and drums and flutes and start making a massively loud noise to wake everybody up. And everybody would, I don't know if you've ever woken up still horribly drunk, but it's a terrible disorientating feeling as you wake up and you, and you would look up and you'd see this giant statue, which hadn't been there when you went to sleep, lit up by the rays of the dawn sun. And it was Hathor, and at that moment you had an experience of the goddess. You were at one with the goddess, and anything you asked the goddess at that moment, she would grant you. But you,
wow.
But you probably couldn't remember what to ask her because you were drunk. But yeah, that's religious drinking, or one form of it.
Wow. So a couple things that really interested me about what you just said, that whole story and how it was choreographed is, one, alcohol as a vehicle for magic or a mystical experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's something that we can trace all the way through history. And then I had a question that I wanted to ask before we move on with that or pursue that line, which is, you know, you said that the ancient Egyptians were just absolute drunks and they were hitting it hard. And that's something that I've heard many times cocktail or alcohol historians would say about early Americans. And so I'm wondering if indeed, as history has gone forward to the present point, we've become more and more moderate as people, or if it's a sort of a common misconception that our forefathers were drunker than we are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a good question, but unfortunately, I don't think there's a single answer to it. It varies around. The question of moderation is often a question of, are you drinking all at once in one little binge, or are you drinking gradually over the day? Anthropologists call this a wet culture, which is a happy drinking culture where you have a little something in the morning, a little something with lunch, a little something. It's the Mediterranean drinking culture, we also call it. Right. And the opposite of that is what's often referred to as a dry culture, which doesn't mean no drinking. What that means is that you do all your drinking in a short burst at some given moment. So Britain is usually defined as a dry drinking culture insofar as we do it in a short burst on a Friday night. And you drink everything you can. The Egyptians seem to have drunk in heavy bursts. And it's a large amount, as I say, drink till you vomit, you know, really hit it until it hurts. That doesn't mean that overall their alcohol consumption might be that different from, and there's another slightly misleading thing a lot of people will have heard, which is that it's completely true that if you were a medieval monk, you would have a ration of beer per day, usually a gallon, which is 8 pints of beer, which is actually not that much if you're drinking all day. I've tried this myself. So if you get 8 large cans of beer, have one with breakfast, then one about 2 hours later, 2 hours later. It's every 2 hours. And you're not completely sober, and you probably shouldn't drive, but you're never drunk. It's just something spread out over the day. So the fact that medieval monks had a ration of a gallon of beer a day, which makes it us sort of think they're all just dancing around utterly sloshed all the time is wrong. I mean, they could get sloshed obviously, but largely it's about how you do it, and do you do it in strong bursts or do you do it in slow gradual bits? And the Egyptians were strong burst drinkers. It was hardcore.
Right. Interesting. So you mentioned monks. We've been talking about gods and goddesses. We've just mentioned monks, and it seems that the religious orders that are in control or dominant in a given time actually, in most cases, have some sort of ties to alcohol. I grew up in the Catholic Church when I was young, and my first encounter with alcohol was the communion wine. Even though it was a very weak, watered-down wine, it was still, my first experience with it. And now
it's a beautiful thing that all over the world there's a strange little point, because as the Catholic religion, or Christianity generally speaking, spread out over the world, you have to have, wherever you go and trying to convert people, including the New World, etc., you have to have wine. So there's conquistadors who arrived with the priests in the Americas. They had on board, they had vines, because you absolutely had to have a source of wine wherever you went to convert people, which made converting
really?
Iceland really quite hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it also just so happens that some of my favorite things to drink or my favorite cocktail ingredients are also the products of Christian orders. So a couple notable examples would be green chartreuse, yellow chartreuse made by the Carthusian monks, and then Benedictine made by the Benedictine monks. So I'm wondering if there's any other important insights to be gotten from the way that alcohol and religion continued as we kind of got out of the gods and goddess era and into the more monotheistic religions.
If you're talking about Christianity, then an important thing to remember about the whole history of drinking is that for most of history, there wasn't much coffee and there wasn't much tea. All these things arrive late to the table, and there wasn't much milk. Milk couldn't be refrigerated or stored, so it got turned into cheese. Fruit juice, hard to come by and hard to keep. So the only, and water, just straight water out of the nearest stream or river. Well, just think of the nearest stream or river to wherever it is you happen to be, and would you drink that water? No, it will make you ill. So alcohol was just in much of the world was the way to drink without getting horribly ill, and therefore not really frowned on. I mean, when the reason they landed at Plymouth Rock, for example, to form your great nation, was simply that they weren't meant to land there, but they'd run out of beer, and that's why they stopped. And they stopped there because we need to plant some stuff, we need to make beer, we can't keep sailing without beer. And these were Puritans, remember, Puritans, but they just obviously you had to have beer, you had to have beer to live. And weirdly enough, even in America, which was largely virgin territory at that time, and the river water really was pretty clean, they still didn't drink it because, you don't drink river water. So even a Puritan was pretty fine with things. If you're getting onto the other monotheistic religions, obviously Islam has a very tricky relationship with alcohol. It should be pointed out, though, that the fact that the Quran finally does ban alcohol in the Hadith, which is the sort of the list of the sayings of the prophets, which aren't in the Quran, is really, really against alcohol. That really didn't stop the Muslim world for drinking for most of history. I mean, Iran is where an awful lot of the earliest wine ever found was made. It was a massive wine producing place, which Arabia hadn't been. So where Islam started in Mecca and Medina, they'd never been big drinkers there. But you get into Iran, Iraq, everyone just kept drinking. What happened was it turned it into the classic example of what I was talking about earlier, a dry culture, a place where you binge drink quickly and secretly rather than publicly and relaxedly drinking all day. So there's this kind of, roughly in the way I think that people take cocaine at a lot of parties today. They run off to a back room, don't let anyone see, and then come back. And of course, everybody knows what's just happened. And also it means that there isn't much of a question of the taste of it. It's a question of how much you can neck and how quickly. There's a lovely little description I found of, it's from, I think, Syria in about 15th century, where a traveller describes how they would get their drinks, and then just before drinking, they would scream as loud as they could, and then down the wine, usually. And the reason for this was that screaming was meant to dislodge the soul from the body, briefly. And so if you went, ah! For a moment, your soul would be outside of your body, at which point you could neck the booze without there being any sin involved. And either way, I know, it's beautiful. Either way, importantly, in Islam, you can ask for forgiveness just as you can in Christianity, and Allah is very merciful. What you can't do is ask for forgiveness whilst you're still planning to repeat it. So oddly enough, though there was a lot of drinking going on amongst the Muslims, it had to be made by non-Muslims. But most of it, we go back to the days of the Caliphate, every city had the Muslim majority, but then there'd be the Greek quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter. So they were all producing lots of booze. And anyone from the Muslim quarter or the Muslim majority could wander over to that bit of town when they were feeling sinful and drink it and then repent the next day, and that's all fine.
That's a really interesting type of symbiotic relationship where these other cultures needed to kind of be there to fit the vice needs of The Muslims, yeah. And it's also what you were saying about the Muslims being a dry society and having there be a very strict rule against alcohol. This also puts us in the realm of certain other historical events, like most notably here in the United States, Prohibition, where alcohol was actually banned except for medicinal purposes, and we have the rise of something called the speakeasy, where people go behind closed doors. There's a password. It's very secretive. It's this short burst drinking, like you were mentioning. So, is there anything that you came across when studying some of the more modern things like Prohibition that's interesting about the way that we drink?
Well, I mean, a classic lead through from the one to the other would be in Iran, where alcohol is currently illegal, where the average Iranian, though, drinks more than the average British person, as I recall. And Iran just had to open up its first alcoholics treatment center because, yes, it's a big binge drinking culture. In America, you had, well, Prohibition is a complicated beast because it was meant to do in the saloon, and the awful men's place of the saloon, where men went and got drunk and spent all the money which they should have been giving to their wives and children and family, but instead they got drunk and then came home angry and beat up their wives and their children and family. And the main driver of Prohibition, which was actually a feminist cause, a completely feminist cause, was to get rid of that whole culture, which it actually did. Prohibition was largely successful in a way which history doesn't get round. It had all sorts of strange outcomes. Obviously, you do have a little bit of binge drinking, but you also have, the cocktail becomes massive during Prohibition, just because the alcohol, though it's, you've probably heard of bathtub gin being made by some gangster in a bathtub in a basement in New York or something. That gin was awful. It was absolutely terrible. So you couldn't just drink it straight, nor any form of the made up synthetic scotch, etc. So you had to drink it with an awful lot of mixers and juices which would make things taste all right. And that's why the cocktail massively, which had always been around for pretty much this reason, how do we make really bad alcohol drinkable, becomes a massive, massive thing during Prohibition. It's also, by the way, the reason, just to be a bit rude to America, because up until about 20 years ago, American beer still had the most terrible reputation. Mm-hmm. There's that wonderful Simpsons episode where the Germans are buying the nuclear power plant. I don't know if they remember that, and they say, your beer, it tastes, how do you say it, like swill to us.
Yeah.
But this is because Prohibition did actually destroy the legitimate American distilling and brewing industry for 13 years. There was no legal alcohol production going on. There was a lot of alcohol production going on in bathtubs, etc. But it's a specialized trade, and everyone who'd been involved in it had to retire and go, who was legitimate, had to retire and go off. And either way, in the big breweries, which had all the specialized equipment, and it's a highly technical thing, they all had to, that equipment was broken down and sold off for scrap. And there is this big gap in legitimate alcohol production, which had a hangover that lasted for another 50, 60 years before American alcohol got back to the level of its counterparts. And that's, right. It's an interesting thing. Whenever you see one of those adverts for, we've been making this rye whiskey the same way for 150 years, it's a lie. It's an absolute lie. Right. Because there was at least 13 years you weren't.
Right. I like the point that you make about Prohibition being a time when the cocktail really, got into the swing of its most popular. And one distinction that I'll make there is that cocktails obviously had been around since the 1860s, 1870s in a manner of speaking. And the interesting thing about those early cocktails is that they tended to be much simpler. The Manhattan was invented in the 1870s, I believe. Manhattan being a very simple cocktail. You're just putting a fortified wine in with a whiskey and a couple dashes of bitters, which at that time were just, essentially that one bottle in the medicine cabinet. So very simple cocktails. And then in Prohibition, when there are these, the spirits are not necessarily bad because they are rustic and it's the best that can be produced by the farmer down the road. They're bad in many cases because they're actually being watered down or cut with bad things to be made to go farther or to appear to be of a higher quality. So it's not an absence of good quality. It's the actual addition of other bad stuff in many situations to the alcohol that required more robust things like citrus and like these bizarre liqueurs and stuff to be brought into the cocktail scene. And so that's why there's a large distinction between pre-Prohibition cocktails, which tended to be simpler, and then Prohibition era cocktails when we started to get into some of those more interesting and esoteric mixers, I guess.
Also, cocktails, oddly enough, a lot of the early references to cocktails which are largely an American invention, as you quite right say. They're to drinking at breakfast, drinking spirits at breakfast, quite specifically. Because one of the big things we would find odd about drinking in almost any other time than the 20th, 21st century is people drinking in the morning, drinking the breakfast. And then an extra thing we would find odd about the Midwest and in America, you have this huge land with transport problems. If you want to carry a barrel of beer, which is a big, heavy thing, then it takes an awful lot of time, money, expense to transport it some distance, and then you drink it quite quickly. So it was an awful lot more efficient to transfer a bottle of whiskey, which is why whiskey becomes, unless you are in a town right next to a brewery, whiskey becomes the drink of the whole West, and it's a very spread out society just geographically. Therefore, your breakfast drink is going to be whiskey, probably. Rum maybe, and a lot of people couldn't really take that at breakfast, so you put it with fruit juice, and that's where the cocktail sort of begins as just a way of making spirits palatable before 9 a.m.
Right. I was reading your book description on Amazon, and it makes some mention to the Wild West Saloon. It's a bit of a teaser. And so I was wondering, since we're in that kind of area of history right now, if you had anything you wanted to share about what you've discovered about the Wild West drinking culture in the United States.
Well, I love doing that chapter because in A Short History of Drunkenness, like I say, I was trying to find ways in which drinking was different in ways that we wouldn't expect, because you assume it's always the same. So I loved finding out, for example, that the medieval tavern, the time of Robin Hood, didn't exist at all. There was no such thing as the village pub at that time in England. And the Wild West Saloon is something we all think we know so well because we've seen it so many times. The batwing doors as you go in. The batwing doors did not exist at all. You go in, the bar's facing you. It wouldn't be. The bar was running down the left-hand side almost always. It was considered very unlucky to be on the right. Behind the bar, there's a mirror, and behind you, the drinker sitting looking in the mirror, there is a long painting of a nearly nude woman. And there are all these little things about it, little rules. Everyone's carrying guns. You have to buy a drink when you arrive in the bar. You have to buy a drink for the person next to you. That's the absolute rule. You must never not do that. They have to accept, and then the round system will go on. One thing I absolutely loved discovering was the moment in any sort of Clint Eastwood Wild West Western film where he goes into the saloon and he says whiskey or something, and they pass him a drink and he just chucks a coin on the bar, and he never says how much was that. And he never gets any change, and you think, well, really? And you think it's just the drama. Clint Eastwood, the man with no name, would seem that cool if he was spending his time saying, well, $4.99. Oh, do you have change for 10 or whatever?
Right.
But in fact, that was exactly the way it worked. Each town would contain, usually at least two saloons. One was the 2-bit place, and the other was the 4-bit place. In the 2-bit joint, every single drink cost 2 bits. In the 4-bit joint, every single drink cost 4 bits. It didn't matter what you would order, you would get 4 bits worth. A bit being a weird form, it's a 12th dollar or something very...
Right.
A silly amount of dollar. And so that's absolutely how things would have gone. You would never have asked the price, you would have never asked for and never got any change. You would always have known how much you were spending. So that little aspect, that detail is utterly true.
Right, right. Interesting. One of the things that I like, and this is actually what you just said made me think of a bit done by an American comedian named Louis C.K., who actually does comment on how just how funny that idea is to just walk into a saloon and ping down a coin and say, I'll have a whiskey and a room for the week and a woman and water for my horse and everything. He just puts down one coin, and it's just sort of this, it seems so bizarre to us today, but
you wouldn't get it all for one coin. You just get the one drink for the one coin.
Right, right. But he was saying that in response to having visited England or the UK, where they still use coins as currency, which is something that we have largely disposed of here in the US. And all of this makes me think of my half a year in the UK when I studied abroad in Bath down in the south, and they had a city beer called Bellringer Ale. And the nice thing about that was that at every pub in the city of Bath, it was the same price. So there was that standardization. Yeah. So I really enjoyed that standardization. That was a really nice feature to me as a drinker because I was on a budget. I was the only one of my friends who had chosen to study abroad in a country where my money was at that point worth less than it is here in the United States. So I was on a budget, and it was great to know that any pub that I walked into would still, I think it was £3 50 quid for a nice pint of Bellringer.
All right, perfect. Yes, it's good to know these things in advance. Definitely. The only thing that occasionally happened was people getting into an argument about, I thought this was a 2-bit place, and they said, no, this is a 4-bit when it looks like a 2-bit place. And of course, the phrase "this 2-bit town" still survives, meaning a place the cheap version of a town.
Right. Well, this has been really, really interesting. I know we've bounced around a lot, and I imagine that your book takes a more sort of logical approach than we have. So I was hoping that you could, before we jump into the lightning round, I was hoping you could just plug the book for our listeners, tell them where they can get their hands on it, and maybe just explain how you go about telling this story of drunkenness through the ages.
So what I wanted to do was see how in Short History of Drunkenness was to see how drunkenness had changed, how alcohol had been different, what the rules were, where if you were 1,000 years ago in a Viking mead hall, or where did you go to get drunk, who did you get drunk with, what time of day did you do it, what did it mean to you, and what were the details of an evening or indeed a morning's drinking like. So what I did was I dropped in at different times, different points, the medieval ale house or the Viking mead hall, or indeed getting drunk with Stalin, or the Dark Ages, the ancient Middle East, etc., or the gin craze in 18th century London, and tried to describe in detail how a drinking session would have gone down. Who would have been there? What would you have talked about? How would the evening have ended up? What would you have sung songs? Would you have told jokes? If so, what would those jokes been like? What sort of chairs were you sitting on? Every detail of an evening's a night out in whatever time place it was in A Short History of Drunkenness. And I went through, I can't remember how many, so 18 chapters of different times and places, and how getting drunk went down and how it worked in those times.
Really, that's fantastic. I love when perspective taking happens in a nonfiction piece, where you're able to, really dive in using the research and put yourself in the place of someone in another time, in another place. I think it's something that we're particularly bad at today, at least here in America. We don't tend to do a lot of perspective taking. We tend to do a lot of arguing and belittling of people we don't agree with based on a color or political creed or something like that. And so that's why I find such value in it. And because it obviously pertains to alcohol, that you have, at the very least, you have my attention. And one question I did want to ask was if there are any popular either books or more specifically movies or television shows that do a really good job of portraying what a drinking culture was like, or if kind of unilaterally they kind of do a bad job in Hollywood.
Generally speaking, I find bad jobs in Hollywood. I think there are some wonderful ones. There's a writer called Patrick McGovern, who's an American, he's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who writes brilliantly about ancient alcohols, ancient beers. He got a new book out called Ancient Brews, but he also did Uncorking the Past. He's the top archaeologist in the world on digging up ancient amphorae and scraping out the residues and working out exactly what was in there. And then he loves to do joint ventures with breweries, microbreweries, making for example, I drank with him. I drank a bottle of Midas Touch beer, which is exactly or as close as damn it to the beer that was the remains of the beer that was found in the tomb of King Midas, so 3,000 years ago or nearly. So he's wonderful. Henry Jeffreys' Empire of Booze is a great one, which is how the British Empire spread all sorts of alcohol around across the world in different ways, shapes and forms. Stephen Ingately, Drink a Cultural History. There are loads of these and they're wonderful. But what I very much want to do was to specialize not on the alcohol, but on what happens when we drink the alcohol, what effect it has on us, how we sort that out, and how we find a place for drunkenness within society, because every society has to find this little gap where alcohol and drunkenness can exist.
Right. Do you find that it's largely a positive thing or a negative thing? If you had to balance out good and evil, which way do you think the scale would swing for alcohol and drunkenness?
I'm basically in favor of alcohol, but to slightly twist your question and not answer it. The thing about all human societies have had a drug, some drug. Humans basically, or most humans, can't take very much reality. We need something to take the edge off it. There have been very few cultures where alcohol had a secondary place, but the Aztecs, for example, they were more into hallucinogens than they were into alcohol. Alcohol just outcompetes the other drugs, really. It's just more fun, it's better, it's healthier. And it's one of those things about when people talk about occasionally the war on drugs and stamping drugs out. There isn't a war on drugs. There's a war between drugs, and alcohol is a drug, caffeine is a drug, nicotine is a drug. People need a drug of some sort. And if you wanted to get rid of cocaine or heroin or whatever it is, just take the tax off alcohol and make it universally available. Nobody will go for the other one, but we need something. We need something. Alcohol seems to me the best for that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really succinct way to put it, and I don't think you dodged the question at all. I think that's spot on. So, where can people, before we jump in, where can people pick up a short history of drunkenness?
A Short History of Drunkenness is available in all good bookshops, and some evil ones. You can get it on the internet off Amazon and all other retailers. It's published by Penguin, and it's published by Three Rivers Press, which is in print. It's a lovely, beautiful book. So bookshops, Amazon, Kindle, obviously, and I believe the audiobook isn't out yet.
Is this a self-read audiobook?
No, it's not. No, I never do that. I always think it's best to leave it to actors.
Okay.
Although it always depresses me slightly that actors are always better at being me than I am.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment, but also a good observation. Yeah. Are you ready for the lightning round?
Yes, absolutely. Now I've advertised A Short History of Drunkenness by Mark Forsyth. Yes.
Yes.
Go for it.
Yes. What is your favorite cocktail or adult beverage? And if you don't have a favorite of all time, what is something that you've perhaps more recently been getting into?
I like Negronis an awful lot. And the reason I like Negronis is I don't know why it is, but when you sip a Negroni, I always feel as though I'm rich. I don't know what it feels just impossible, inconceivable that I'm not rich, that I'm not sitting on my yacht in the sun sipping the Negroni. There's something about the taste. I don't know what it is, but it always just makes me feel I'm king of the world.
Okay, yeah, and isn't that what we all want to feel?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. That's a great... I love a Negroni myself. You are in the land of gin. Do you have a particular go-to gin when you make your Negroni?
No, I don't. I think I usually go for Bombay Sapphire. Although I do like a pink gin, which is just gin and Angostura bitters. But it's got to be Portsmouth gin. But that's a lovely little drink.
Yes. Okay. If you were an alcohol-related tool, ingredient, or product, and this can be contemporary or historical since you know so much about some historical items, what would you be and why?
Oh, would there be? I didn't think of the historical ones, like a Viking beer strainer or something. I don't know. I'd probably be a lemon zester, but I would like. I think I'd like to just be an ice block.
Okay.
An ice block would be good. Yes, yeah, just be there, all cold and calm and quiet, and then slowly dissolve.
Yeah. And especially considering, what a huge role ice played in the creation of the cocktail, and as refrigeration and freezing and the culture moved from the traditional ice house to something that's a bit more industrial, that really allowed cocktails to come about. So an ice block, that's fantastic. What is a Viking beer strainer?
An awful lot of old beers were far more porridgey than we think of beer today. We think of beer as being all clean and crisp. So rather like a tea strainer, just a little funnel a mesh that you pour the beer through to get rid of all the little bits.
All right.
In ancient Sumeria, sort of 5,000 years ago, they drank their beer through a straw. Everyone would gather around a single pot of beer with a straw, and that way all the sediment floated to the surface, but the straw meant you could get underneath.
Right. Interesting. Almost like the way that yerba mate is drunk, from the little cup where you stick the straw with the strainer into the cup and then you pass it around.
Yeah.
Interesting. If you could have a drink with anyone in the world, past or present, who would you be? Where would you go? What would you drink? Just kind of paint a picture for us. It seems like you're good at that.
It's a cheap way of answering the question in a sense, but why not go for one of the most famous or mysterious people? Obviously being a writer like Shakespeare, but then Jesus, big drinker. He sat down with the publicans and sinners and he created the wedding at Cana. He creates between 60 and 90 gallons of wine, and that must be the best wine in all history.
Right.
If you're going to believe in such things, it's got to be. This is Jesus. This is Messiah quality wine. It has to be pretty damn amazing. And he sounds like fun. And it would be at least intriguing. You'd be able to come back and say, yep, I'm convinced, or vice versa. So I'd have a go at that. Otherwise, I'd like to settle down with Chaucer, I think, for a nice bit of medieval ale and see how he was and what sort of guy he was.
Yeah, Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales, and a lot of those characters were fairly drunk.
Oh yeah, completely. They're all getting drunk and falling over every which way, which makes me feel that he ought to have known his drinking. Also, Chaucer's father was a wine merchant, so he would have had some kind of in on that.
I'm as you were describing the wine from the wedding at Cana, the question arose in my mind as to whether Robert Mondavi would give that 100 points, or if he would rate it a 99 and still hold off.
It has to be 100 points. Theologically certain that's a 100-point wine.
Oh, beautiful. So you listed some books a couple moments ago. Can you just quickly review which books, if someone wanted to go pick out some historical accounts or books that kind of orbit your work on drunkenness, are there any good ones for them to look for?
I mean, a lot of the way you do the research or one way in is to look at sort of historical accounts of drinking. So, for example, the best look we have at what a Viking sumbel was like, which is a big drinking session in mead hall, comes from the poem Beowulf, which describes it in some detail. Now, it probably wasn't always like Beowulf. Beowulf is describing the best and finest, most heroic version of the sumbel. But so, I mean, if you read Beowulf, you'll get a strong notion of how things went down with the chief being served first, and then everyone down in order. The serving is done entirely by the wives and the women folk, who are, in Viking culture, I'm afraid, were just there to serve beer to the menfolk and mead and stuff. And also, it gives you an insight into how things went down. There's a bit in Beowulf when he, spoiler alert, he dies at the end. And they lament him and what a wonderful warrior he was, and how absolutely great and what a great guy. And in this great sort of funeral oration or lament, they say of him, he was such a wonderful guy. And the most amazing thing about him, this one-off, was he never killed any of his friends when he was drunk.
Oh, That's sweet.
And you go, wow, that's a one-off thing. That tells you almost everything you need to know about Viking drinking.
Yeah, a real sweetheart.
But to get through your whole life without killing your mates drunk was a thing.
Beautiful. Well, we'll
something you'd be remembered for.
For sure, and so he was. I will, in the show notes, we're going to list some of those books that you listed earlier. And I just wanted to, before we give folks your digital contact info, I wanted to know if you have any advice for someone who is just starting to learn about or experiment with drinking or cocktails or what have you.
I certainly wouldn't have taken anybody's advice when I was just learning or thinking about them. Best piece of advice, only drink what you're comfortable with. I used to know this years ago when I was 18. I just arrived at university. I knew this girl who drank a lot, and she had an incredibly strong head for alcohol. And I would see people who didn't know her. She drank at about a pint every 20 minutes. And men who didn't know her, who were trying to impress her, would always try and drink to keep up. And they would see she had finished her drink, so they would down theirs. And that's when you get unpleasantly drunk. As long as you're just drinking comfortably at your own rate and not hurrying for anyone, not speeding up, not slowing down, not playing drinking games, then you will, in my experience, get happily, comfortably, and very pleasurably drunk.
Right. Try to embody the block of ice, just cool and enjoyable and just sitting there doing its own thing, and nice, and you'll remain as clear-headed as possible.
Well, it's not about necessarily being clear-headed. It's a question of not feeling a bit ill.
Yes.
If you see what I mean.
Ultimately, yes. So, Mark, how can people connect with you on the internet, whether that's a website or social media or by email?
There's my blog, which is Inky Fool. There's Twitter, which is @InkyFool, and then there's the Facebook Inky Fool page, and they're all wonderful ways of getting in touch. Not that I'm afraid I'm not a massive internet person. I'm too busy drinking.
Right. Well, that's beautiful. We will list all of those on the website, as well as a selection of your previous publications, which people can also check out. So, Mark, I just wanted to say thank you, and I am really grateful that you took the time to kind of take this little historical trip down our alcoholic past.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been great.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's two big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook @modernbarcart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning, so remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and spam assistance by Spamantha Reed. A great many spammy facts about how people consumed spam, and spam throughout the ages, courtesy of Mark Forsyth, and a little bit of spam magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Spam Cart production. Copy Spam 2000 and Spam.